Hello, I'm Richard Dolan, and welcome to UFOs, the Big Picture. I'm very happy to be here with you. I want to talk this week about history and future of media relations to the UFOs subject in general. There's a long history of repression by what we would call mainstream dominant media relating to the UFO subject. Anyone who's studied the subject knows this. I don't really need to go to too much of the history, although I will talk a little bit about it. But really, I think the thing is to understand that media is an evolving creature. And so when we talk about mainstream media of the 1940s and 50s and 60s, that's a different creature than mainstream media today. Mainstream media today includes Google, it includes Facebook, as well as the other major media establishments that we've all talked about. So it's an evolving creature. But one of the things that has remained consistent, obviously, with mainstream media is that it is highly corporate, it is very powerful, it is very wealthy, and it is very entrenched in what we might call national security and financial interests. So all of that has remained consistent throughout the years. One thing that I can say in the relationship of media to UFOs, since we'll just say the 1940s, is that the establishment media, however we want to define it at the time, has been consistently hostile to the subject of UFOs, with a very few exceptions. It has been consistently hostile. And really the main exceptions, if you really get down into it, don't come from establishment media so much as local, smaller media outlets, whether it was in the 1940s and 50s with local newspapers reporting UFOs much more openly than, say, the New York Times, which has never been honest about it, or today with more alternative or regional news outlets. I think of maybe George Knapp out of KLAS in Las Vegas is a good example of a mainstream-ish analyst who is very engaging in the UFO subject, but he's still regional. And I think that's been the pattern throughout. So again, media reporting, if you go back through the Cold War, 1940s, 50s, 60s, was not all negative about UFOs. And the main reason is that media consolidation hadn't yet completely, fully taken place. The post-World War II era was filled with massive media consolidation. And it didn't happen overnight, though. It happened by degrees. And so you still have this kind of remnant of the independent newspapers from the early 20th century that were not fully in coordination with the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, through things like Operation Mockingbird, which was going full speed ahead during the Cold War. Mockingbird was a CIA coordination of U.S. mainstream newspapers, radio, TV, to spin news on behalf of the national security community. Anyone who doesn't know about the history of Mockingbird really needs to understand that. It's important because Mockingbird isn't just part of the past. That pattern has continued to this day. But what you find is a couple of touchstone points in the Cold War. One relating to UFOs, one being the Robertson panel of early 1953, where you have a CIA coordinated panel with these CIA connected and intelligence community connected scientists who meet in a classified setting to talk about UFOs. And their number one conclusion, all right, is that we need, they said, to coordinate with the mainstream media and with the media establishment companies like Disney, for example, as well as the major media news organizations like CBS and so on. We need to coordinate with them to debunk UFOs and to reduce public interest. This was their number one conclusion. And it worked. It's what they did. They talked about doing public relations campaigns to use psychiatrists and astronomers and celebrities to demystify UFOs to the public. They talked about recommending the services of Walt Disney Corporation. And they actually also talked about the smart move that it would be if the government were to monitor civilian groups that were studying UFOs because of their potential to influence mass thinking. This is way back in 1953. where these intelligence recommendations were made. Because even then it was said, well, these civilian UFO groups might be used for subversive purposes. Subversive meaning anything that really caused someone to question the truth of what was coming out of the United States government on UFOs. Really, really interesting. By the way, during the 50s, the government severely clamped down on the ability of, say, airline pilots to report UFOs and to report them to the media. There was an issue put out in, I think, 1954 called GenApp 146, which made it virtually impossible for airline pilots to report UFOs. So the media was very much, working with the national security community to keep UFOs away from the public. Even as late as the 1960s, the Robertson panel's recommendations were explicitly being fulfilled. Back in 1966, Walter Cronkite hosted a CBS UFO special called Friend, Foe, or Fantasy. And it was classic deflating the balloon tactics, so to speak. In other words, here's Cronkite saying it would be impossible for the government to hide this information from the public. Like, he literally said that. They brought in people like Carl Sagan, a very dapper Carl Sagan in 1966, I should say, who used the word pseudoscientific to describe the flying saucer myths and so forth. He says, this isn't a science issue. This is psychology. It's theology. Thanks, Carl Sagan. Good work for the national security state you did there. We know for a fact that that special in 1966 was done explicitly in reference to the Robertson panel's recommendation to work with media to debunk UFOs. So that was then. By the way, in the 1970s, Operation Mockingbird was finally exposed. Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame did the main scoop on it and really talked about how the CIA had at least 400 paid journalists. Wow. 400 journalists on your payroll, probably much more, frankly. Ask yourself, I've often wanted to think about what you could do, what I could do, if any of us had 400 mainstream journalists working for us. How much news could you manage, manipulate, influence, spin? A lot, a great deal. And that was what the CIA did. This is all done, for patriotic reasons. Journalists at the time working for the New York Times, working for CBS, working for AP and Reuters, felt that they were doing their patriotic duty to work for the government against the Russians, against the Soviets, and all of that. Sure, they thought they were doing the right thing, but of course what they were doing, what they did back then and what journalists are doing to this very day is undermining the very foundations for freedom of the press and freedom of speech indeed. When you rely on your media for fair and honest and unbiased information about anything, and when they're secretly working for your number one intelligence agency, that's a bit of a conflict of interest. And that went on throughout the entire Cold War. It was exposed in the late 70s, and then the CIA, very legalistically, in lawyer-like fashion said, well, we no longer have paid relationships with journalists to influence news on behalf of our blah, blah, blah. Sure. All right. The fact is, you don't often need paid relationships, CIA. These journalists will jump over each other to have a relationship with the CIA because it's a career maker then and now. There's no difference here. So that was Mockingbird. The UFO coverage was part of the Mockingbird system. And by the way, there's been some pretty nice work done on a kind of a layout and how the Cold War media management went from the Robertson panel's directives through the CIA to New York Times, Time Inc., CBS, NBC, ABC, the various wire services. And here's an interesting part, the National Enquirer. Remember the National Enquirer, that tabloid that had all crazy stories about Elvis being seen in laundromats and everything else. The National Enquirer wasn't just some crazy tabloid news. The National Enquirer was run by a man named Generoso Pope, who bought it in 1952. By the way, how much money where he got that money from has been a matter of speculations, because Gene Pope had worked for the CIA's psychological warfare unit in 1951, allegedly leaving the CIA in 1952. It was said, incidentally, that the Inquirer was bought with the help of the crime figure Frank Costello. Never been proven. But the thing about what the Inquirer did is that it sensationalized UFO information. What was interesting is that a number of the UFO stories that the Inquirer published, particularly in the 70s, turned out to be legitimate. For example, missiles over Malmstrom Air Force Base, and other nuclear bases in the 1960s and 70s. But they packaged it within all this other crazy stuff to make the UFO subject look utterly ridiculous. It was all part to discredit genuine information that's in the Inquirer. It can't be legit, right? Gene Pope was friends with Richard Nixon. Gene Pope was at his funeral. One of the pallbearers was a former Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird. Good grief. Who actually, I think, gave a eulogy for Gene Pope. How does that happen if you're just the publisher of the National Enquirer? Well, that's how it happens. Someone once asked Pope, how is it that you know all these powerful people in Washington? And Pope just said kind of enigmatically, well, you know, one hand washes the other. So there you have it. Incidentally, Pope also created the weekly World News, which had all those crazy covers of every U.S. president from Bill Clinton onward shaking the hand of some wacky-looking alien, reptilian, gray creature, whatever. That's the weekly World News, the over-the-top version of even the Inquirer, created as well by Gene Pope. But anyway, moving into our own era, what you find with the mainstream establishment news is, not only would they, when they covered UFOs, really dismiss it as pseudoscience and the like, but they utterly ignored the critically important release of information through Freedom of the Information Act in the 1970s and 80s. What people sometimes forget is that for years and years and decades, the government was able to deny that they had any information on UFOs, they had any interest on UFOs, because it was pre-FOIA. There was no ability for citizens to petition the government for UFO-related documents. That changed after Watergate, after Vietnam, when the Freedom of Information Act was significantly strengthened, and guess what? Thousands of pages of UFO-related documentation pertaining to the FBI, CIA, all the military agencies, all came out. Well, not all, but a lot of them came out, and they were damning indictments of the lies that had been perpetrated by the government all those years. When the government said, no, we don't do UFOs, not interested, suddenly all of that was exposed to be completely false. Government agencies were deeply interested in UFOs, and yet the corporate dominated media establishment had nothing to say about any of this for years and years. In fact, they've still never, we're in 2019 for goodness sake, and they still have not discussed any of the implications of all of the massive thousands of pages of documentation through Freedom of Information. What we find in the last 20 years now of a development of internet and World Wide Web, and completely alternative media. You and I are part of that alternative media right now, simply by participating in this video. What we find is that the establishment media has ignored, generally, its first tactic was to ignore the alternative media. Its second tactic was to ridicule what was coming out of alternative media, because those are unsanctioned sources. And what they now do, it's very obvious, is they call it fake news. Or when they really want to get down to things that they don't like, they'll call it hate speech. But my prediction is that fake news, the label of fake news, is going to be very possibly anyway, the fundamental tactic that will be used in the near future against anti or non-establishment narratives. And the UFO subject continues to be a non-establishment narrative, and we're going to see, I think increasingly, the move to censorship over non-establishment narratives will segue from hate speech to fake news. Hate speech has still been very effective. 2018 was really the year of deplatforming all kinds of voices, and the number one reason cited was the nebulous hate speech. It was very difficult to define hate speech, obviously, but that was the main thing that was used. But I think what we're going to see moving forward is an attempt to move into relegating non-official narratives as fake news, and these will be increasingly marginalized, and I think there's a real danger that they'll be deplatformed in the name of protecting the public from dangerous disinformation. All right, we already saw an attempt to do this earlier in 2018 by the government of Malaysia, which actually had passed and then repealed a law to imprison or at least severely fine agencies that spread what the government considered to be fake news. Can you imagine? Right. So there was an outcry against this, and it was repealed. It didn't have any effect. The French government, under Macron, actually the French President Macron, put forward a proposal, and this was debated in the French Senate and rejected. But the proposal was to prevent foreign news agencies, this was obviously directed against Russia, foreign state-owned media corporations from influencing French elections with false information and propaganda. Just like, wow. I have a feeling that the motion was banned because they would have said that, well, that would probably ban BBC as well. And so, which really, what's the difference? So they were not able to. But the point is that what we're seeing is definitely a movement in 2018 and now moving forward into 2019, of attempts to ban or at least deplatform purveyors of fake news because they do not fit an establishment narrative. This is where Facebook and Google come in, obviously. Where we once thought a few years ago that YouTube and other alternative media sites were really going to be able to challenge the traditional dinosaur mainstream narrative on things, we're now seeing, well, it's Google, Facebook, they are part of the club. And so now we're really going to have to see how this all turns out. One thing that we can say is that the news media, and I'm including here Google and Facebook, obviously, along with the traditional, whether it's Fox or NBC or CBS or whatever, or MSNBC, they're all influenced more than ever by the intelligence community. That includes CIA and other intelligence and government groups. The Pentagon, for example, spends huge amounts of money to influence its social image online. An enormous sum of money, including, incidentally, the creation of so-called sock puppets, that is, online trolls with fake persona that appear underneath the news articles that you read online. They say it's all Russian bots, but actually, I would bet anything that no one is better at this than the American bots that are underneath the news articles that you read. It wasn't that long ago that we had the 2011 Arab Spring, and if you look on your history on that, there was a journalist by the name of Amber Lyon who talked. She was a CNN journalist at the time, and Amber Lyon, to her great credit, has simply gone independent since those days, and she stated quite openly that CNN back then was routinely paid by the United States government and by foreign governments, she said this, to selectively report on certain events and make up fake news stories. All right, that was in 2011. Some of you may recall the statements of the late German journalist, Dr. Udo Ulfkotte. He died about a year ago, who he's on YouTube, and you can, I'm sure, still see this, where he talks about it. He says, we all lie for the CIA. He talked about how European journalists were dominated by the American CIA to the extent that the CIA would write fake news stories and have them put their names on the bylines. All right. So that goes on to this day. So the system remains in place. Now, what's interesting, and I'm going to wrap this up in a minute, the world is a much more topsy-turvy, crazy place than it's ever been before. So we see, um, the web. What I'm doing here with you right now would have been unthinkable in an earlier era. This is still like a level of communication that exists now that no one could have dreamed of, and yet here we are doing this. So there's a couple of tactics that can be taken by establishment powers to deal with this. All right, there is, yes, an kind of an unstoppable force happening because the genie's out of the bottle and the internet is out here allowing us to talk to each other like this and to share information. Um, so there are two tactics that you have to watch for. One is stopping, not really plugging the leaks, but stirring up so much garbage and distraction that no one will know what is true. And that's partly what has happened, particularly in the UFO field over the past few years. The amount of disparate narratives cramming themselves into this field, outrageous claims that any rational person would look at and say, no, wrong. But they've infested the field. That's one possibility of an operation that's being performed against the UFO subject. Unless you think this is crazy tinfoil hat territory, I would caution you to guess again. There are many, many studies, U.S. government studies, Cass Sunstein's 2008 most particularly, that talked about the efficacy of doing something like this to cognitively infiltrate these dissident groups. All right. So that's one thing. Another thing, though, I think deplatforming is a real possibility, and it's kind of like a nuclear option in the war against truth. Again, under the premise of calling all of this fake news. My guess is it won't work. All right. There's too much coming out these days, and there are too many prominent individuals increasingly who are willing to talk about the UFO phenomenon in an intelligent, sophisticated, technologically sophisticated way. All right, so it's really going to be difficult to stop this train from reaching the station. I think it's going to happen. But if the deplatforming efforts, or if the power elite, if we want to call them that, want to double down and really decide that they do not want a form of UFO disclosure to arrive or to happen, they may attempt to stir up more garbage or move forward with genuine deplatforming of the UFO field. Don't think it can happen. It can. But I think it will fail. I think that people will always find a way to get around these things. We're creative and we're persistent, and we know history is on our side. The UFO phenomenon has been developing and growing in our public consciousness for a full human lifetime now. We've been talking about this, and it's gone through many, many permutations and a strong evolution in what we have been able to learn about it. It's not going to stop. All right. Right now, as I see it, there's almost kind of a foot race going on. It's between the people and our would-be handlers, our elites. Who's going to get to that finish line first? In other words, will we be able successfully to achieve a kind of breakthrough, a real genuine breakthrough of UFO information to break out to the public in the form of a genuine public conversation? All right, valid, genuine information that changes the public landscape. I think we can. On the other side of it, there's always a possibility that a system of total control, a clampdown, deplatforming, and confusion can indeed happen on the other side of it. Nothing is written in stone here. This is a genuine drama being played out, and we're all part of it. My guess, though, is that truth will out. You can't bury the truth forever. You just can't. It's going to come out. And the only question is how and when. And I think we're in an era where we're seeing the writing on the wall, and it's going to happen. Those people who deny it, all of these years who've denied it, are going to find themselves with a lot of egg on their face and very embarrassed indeed. But it won't matter. No one will care about that. All we're going to care about then is moving forward and getting as much genuine information as we can. That's the only way. Genuine information, truth, is the only way that we as a society, as a civilization, can ever hope to move to the next level of whatever it is we're meant to be. That's all I've got to say. If you like what you see, hey, click like, subscribe to my channel. I have a weekly newsletter, which is available at my site, Richard Dolan Members. It's free. Go check it out. It'll keep you posted on everything that I'm up to. I really want to thank you for being here with me today, and I'll catch you next time. This is Richard Dolan for UFOs, The Big Picture. Bye.